Hello, and welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. I'm Margaret Fox, Associate Pastor for Adult Ministries at Westminster, here with our scholar in residence, Matt Skinner. And our guest today is Safwat Marzouk, who is a associate professor of Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. And Safwat, we are so excited that you are here with us today to share your perspective on the book of Exodus as a professor, as an Egyptian Christian, as somebody who is a Presbyterian minister. You're located in so many different contexts that I think will really enrich and enliven our understanding of this book. So thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Margaret, for the introduction, and to you and Matt for the invitation. And I very much look forward to our conversation together on the book of Exodus.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, I would love to start with just a very basic question, which is, what's in this book? What will our readers find there? And then what's this book sort of doing in the larger picture of the Bible as a whole?
The book of Exodus picks up the story from where the book of Genesis lifted off, with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob finding themselves in the land of Egypt. So the book itself sets itself up as continuing a narrative that has already started in the book of Genesis, with the Israelites are now in Egypt. They have been saved and rescued from the famine in Egypt, but then the book also signals a shift in the relationship between the Egyptians and the Israelites, by noting that the Israelites have become fruitful, and they have multiplied, and then which is obviously a fulfillment of the divine vision for the creation articulated in Genesis 1. But then the book immediately talks about a shift in the relationship when it notes that there was a new king rose over Egypt that did not know Joseph. So as the book starts off, it's kind of like bringing traditions from the book of Genesis in terms of creation, and also the narrative of Joseph, where Joseph himself, even though he was forced migrant, he thrived in Egypt. And through cooperation with the Egyptians, he was able to save the Egyptians and the Canaanites from the famine, including his own family. But then there is a new shift. There is a new kind of relationship that starts to emerge. And that new shift is not marked by hospitality, and is not marked by inclusion. It's now marked by fear of the other, where Pharaoh starts to muster the fear of the masses of these Israelites who are growing. And Pharaoh starts to see the flourishing of the Israelites as a threat, and starts to use different tactics in order to control the Israelites. So instead of hospitality, there is now fear. That Pharaoh translates that fear into enslavement and into oppression and into attempt to kill the firstborn boys of the Israelites. And we read the resistance of multiple women, including even Pharaoh's daughter herself, and the midwives, and Moses' mother, and Moses' sister, that these women start to resist this tyranny that starts to emerge even before God showed up. God shows up actually in the narrative because these women resisted, because these women challenged this patriarchal perspective that is oppressive to all Israelites, that is operating out of fear. Then Moses is born, and he attempts to rescue an Israelite from an Egyptian taskmaster, and his attempt fails. He runs to the wilderness. He lives as a sojourner, and in his sojourn, God calls him to go back to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. And he goes back with a task to liberate the Israelites. But that task, as much as it is a confrontation to Pharaoh and his own regime and his own system that oppressed the Israelites for a long time, it is also a message to the Israelites themselves to reveal the God who is liberating, the God who is the God of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So as much as it is a call to confront oppressive systems, it is also a call for the Israelites themselves to understand themselves in a new way, rather than being defined as the ones who are enslaved and oppressed by Pharaoh. Now they are called to worship Yahweh. And the Hebrew text uses the same root, the word avad, which means to serve or worship, to talk about the enslavement of the Israelites to Pharaoh. And when Moses goes to Pharaoh, it's obviously a message of liberation, but then Moses goes with the message of, let my people go so that they may worship me. And that language of worship is what frames the whole book of Exodus as a whole. So it is indeed a liberation from enslavement, as Moses confronts Pharaoh and then unleashes plagues, and they are confronted with the sea, and they cross the sea and they go into the wilderness. But the book culminates with them building a tabernacle after God reveals God's self on the mountain. So
can I interrupt really quick? I just have one quick question that just raised. And I'm afraid we'll lose it.
Yeah, get in there.
When God reveals God's own self to Moses, are the Israelites in Egypt already how are they worship? Do we know how they're worshiping?
No, we don't.
They just understand themselves as a nation, but not necessarily a religion. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
There is not much in the book of Exodus itself about how much they were aware of Yahweh or their traditions, but the book of Ezekiel, though, claims, Ezekiel chapter 20 claims actually the Israelites were worshiping Egyptian idols. We get also a hint of that in the book of Joshua chapter 24. But that's not what the book of Exodus is really focused on as much in terms of what the Israelites knew or did not know about Yahweh and Yahweh's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then when God reveals God's self to Moses, God introduces God's self in that way.
Yeah.
I am the God of your ancestors.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but then I think as much as we read a lot of details and progression of the narrative in the book of Exodus, where chapters 1 through 15 are talking about the Israelites in Egypt, and then chapters 15 towards the end and 16 to chapter 40 is their journey towards the promised land. But the book ends with them in the wilderness. They have not reached the promised land in the book of Exodus itself. But the book ends with almost 10 chapters of talking about the tabernacle, which is also perceived as work.
Right, like a building project almost. Not of a monument to Pharaoh, but they are building something in the beginning and at the end.
Absolutely. But instead of them being forced, when they are building the tabernacle, they volunteer. And they give gifts in order to accomplish that building. But this kind of theme and motif holds the book together. So the book is not just about liberation, although that is central, liberation from, but it's also liberation into. So it's not just that they are now leaving Egypt, but that they are also entering into a covenant with Yahweh. And it's this connection between worship and liberation becomes really crucial. And worship is not used here in the sense of like showing up on a particular gathering at a particular time to do, although that is central and crucial in some rituals and some practices. But it's also about allegiance, that they belong to Yahweh, they do not belong to Pharaoh. Yeah.
There's another question I have here about kind of terminology. I just preached a sermon on Exodus 3 and noticed that use of the word Hebrews to describe the Israelites a lot towards the beginning. When does that language shift towards Israelites, or how do those words show up, and what do they mean in the text?
Absolutely. The word Hebrews is quite often used, or for the most part, it is used when it's talking about the Israelites in relation to foreigners or to the other. So the term is in some ways trying to distinguish some sort of an ethnic identity in relation to others who are not identified as Hebrews. But both terms are used, to describe the same community, Hebrews or the Israelites. Obviously, the term the Israelites is connected to the change of the name of Jacob into Israel. So, and this kind of connection with the ancestry becomes also really important, because if we see them as forced migrants, if we see them as people who are living in a land that is not theirs, the land that is Egypt, one of the crucial things for migrant communities, and this is one of the things that I think is also really important to remember when we read most of the biblical traditions, is most of these biblical traditions were written by and for people who were on the move. In some ways, even if they are remembering these aspects of their identity at some point, at some time later when they were in the land and accumulating these and doing these traditions, putting them together, but they were also ways through which they were trying to define who they are in relation to others, and this is where the term Hebrews come, but also in relation to themselves, remembering their ancestry. Because one of the basic needs for migrant communities is actually to find roots, to find the narrative that in some ways transcends time. So that term, the Israelites, is crucial in that it gives them a larger narrative. Hence this divine introduction: I am the God of your ancestors. Right. That this Moses is not uprooted. He does have a hybrid identity, being both Egyptian and Hebrew or Israelite, but at the same time, he has a larger narrative that he's part of, and that the Israelites are part of.
That's beautiful. I usually think of the giving of the law as the kind of identity shaping moment in that book of Exodus, but what I'm hearing here is this, that it's actually also narrative. The narrative is functioning kind of in that same way as providing identity and groundedness to this community that's on the move at God's command, not out of, that's responding to God's
absolutely.
call.
Yeah. The identity piece is crucial in the book of Exodus, because again, if we read the enslavement and let my people go so that they may worship me as these kind of two ends of the directions that the narrative is trying to get rid of, this idea of that they are enslaved to Pharaoh and now they belong to Yahweh, the God of their ancestors, as a marker for identities. So yes, it could have taken a larger shape in the theophany when God appeared on the mountain and giving the Torah, and they are shaped as a community that belongs to Yahweh. But I read it as early as the divine revelation to Moses in chapter 3, where God says, I am the God of your ancestors, or God even remembering the covenant, that these Israelites do not belong to Pharaoh. Their allegiance is to Yahweh.
That's beautiful.
So I was taught somewhere, I don't remember where, or I read it somewhere, that the way to understand the first half, or one way to understand the first half, is to recognize that Pharaoh is not just a king, that he's a deity of sorts, and part of what's going on is a contest between the God of Israel and Pharaoh. Is that a useful way to read it? Was I taught rightly? Is that what part of what's going on, is this kind of separation from not just a tyrant, but really a kind of rival to God? Is that useful?
It in some ways it does help to see this kind of dichotomy between Pharaoh and Yahweh. Sometimes I get wary of like trying to make so much of this idea that Pharaoh saw himself as the child of, the god Re, for example, and that pharaohs always divinized themselves or made deities out of themselves. Even though that perception does appear in Egyptian traditions, it does also appear in the biblical traditions themselves, sure. Where, like in Psalm 2, God adopts the king, right? So we have that royal ideology even within Israel itself. So because I think I'm okay with us trying to create this dichotomy between Pharaoh and Yahweh without just villainizing Pharaoh just because Pharaoh as a human being is trying to make himself God in some way. What Pharaoh does is bad in itself. It doesn't need that addition. There are though attempts to read, for example, the plagues, possibly as a way in which Yahweh, as the God of the Israelites, is in some ways in a battle with the gods of the Egyptians. So if a particular god, like Re, for example, is the sun god, and the rise of the sun is a sign of a sense of order in Egyptian mythologies, which that is well documented in Egyptian writings, then when Yahweh controls darkness and brings on darkness, Yahweh is unleashing chaos on Egypt, and it's Yahweh who is the true God in some ways, not the gods of the Egyptians. And we get a hint of that actually in the book of Exodus itself, that there is some sort of a competition between Yahweh and the gods of the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, like, that continues to raise lots of questions on how do we think about reading these texts in an interreligious setting, where like in our contemporary context, we are trying to understand our faith traditions in relation to other faith traditions rather than over against other faith traditions. And I think maybe one of the helpful things for us to remember is that this discourse that we read in the book of Exodus, as well as in other parts of the Bible, this is the discourse of the powerless. These are the communities that are trying to find a sense of liberation in the midst of all of these empires. Mm-hmm. So part of that competition between our God versus their gods is a way through which the powerless is trying to find a place in the world, rather than the empire trying to impose its gods on the others, which could be the experience of many Western colonialisms or imperial expansions using religion to oppress others. So as much as we read this competition between Yahweh and the Egyptian gods, we need to remember how we enter the text. Mm-hmm. And that the voice that we read here is the voice of the powerless, trying to find a sense of hope in the midst of the oppression of the empires around them, rather than it's the powerful trying to, subjugate everyone else to the religious perspective.
Yeah. That's a very helpful distinction. And thinking about, we'll talk a bit in our presentation about when Exodus might have been written down and who's remembering this story and why are they remembering this story. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very helpful. I think that's a helpful frame for this whole course that we're doing here, is thinking about the cultural setting, the context in which these texts were written, and what is it like, from where we're located now to enter those texts. I think this is super helpful.
We do like get some glimpses in the book of Exodus itself of also some sort of inclusive language, where, for example, you have a priest of Midian in some ways lead the first act of offering sacrifices. And Moses encounters God in the wilderness, so there is lots of conversations around how the mountain of God, the Horeb in Sinai, where is that, and in connection to the Midianites. So you do have some sort of like a glimpse that is not always competition between these different traditions. Although obviously the priest of Midian acknowledges Yahweh as the supreme God, right? So there is that layer, but you have some sort of an openness that it's not Moses and Aaron who lead the offering of the sacrifices. You have this, priest that is the priest of the Midianites who does that.
Yeah, well, I love that. I mean, I love the pulling of sort of nuance and openness out of this, because I think this could be read as a sort of good guys, bad guys, kind of narrative pretty easily. I am curious about the role, not just of the sort of the Midianites or the other peoples that are sort of adjacent to the Israelites, but about the portrayal of Egypt itself. To what extent is, I think about, in so much of American film and literature, the Russians are kind of the cartoon bad guys. What do you see as the role of Egypt here? You've written a book about Egypt portrayed as a monster in the book of Ezekiel, which I think is so fascinating. How does that portrayal unfold both in the book of Exodus and elsewhere? And I'd love to hear, your perspective as an Egyptian Christian too. What is it like to encounter the text and that sort of language in the text in that way?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking this question, because this is the question that actually led me into biblical scholarship. So,
awesome.
In my journey so how do I read the Old Testament as a Christian Egyptian? So in some ways, and this will be covered, it sounds, from what Matt said about the when you teach the class, you will cover some of the kind of the historical piece and the memory aspect, is that it's Egypt was at some point during the New Kingdom an empire that reached far into the land of Canaan. But at that time, we don't have like an Israelite people yet at that time. You have, Egypt has a hegemony, but then towards the time when supposedly the event of Exodus happened around 1250 BCE, this is the time that is accepted by most scholars now, Egypt started to decline as an empire. And maybe that's possibly part of kind of the memory that is like being built in narrating the story of the book of Exodus. But one of the interesting things is that for the most part, when most of these traditions that are intertwined in the book of Exodus itself, Egypt actually was not the superpower of the ancient Near East. Egypt, yes, continued to influence the politics in Judah and Israel, but surprisingly, sometimes as an ally, actually, against Assyria, the other empire coming from modern-day Iraq, and Babylon, also coming from modern-day Iraq. In like sometimes alliance even with Judah against the Assyrians, or with Israel against the Assyrians, and with Judah against the Babylonians during the time of Zedekiah, for example, which obviously the prophets do not like at all, because they need to trust only in Yahweh. So there is that historical memory of an Egypt that seems to be operating in the narrative of the book of Exodus and other parts of the Bible. But when these traditions were being shaped, there were other empires that it's likely that Egypt is kind of like the example that Yahweh judged in a sense, because they have oppressed us. So that narrative is being told and retold during other times of other empires in order to give hope in times of uncertainty and in times of political change and upheavals of other empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians later. Mm-hmm. So Egypt becomes this symbol. And possibly that's why the book of Exodus does not mention a name of a pharaoh. It says, a new king grows over Egypt, or Moses said to Pharaoh, or God said, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. It does not mention which pharaoh. Mm-hmm. It just uses this Egypt as a symbol, Pharaoh as a symbol for this power that abuses itself in oppressing others, in controlling others, and so on. So it could be rooted in a particular memory, but in some ways it talks about Egypt as this kind of symbol that represents some sort of a pattern for oppression that then Yahweh interferes and liberates. So one of the hermeneutical questions that I personally struggled with is, how do we enter into the biblical narrative? And even though I grew up in Egypt, went to church all my life in Egypt before I moved to the US, and I pastored in Egypt, most of us trained or have been taught to read the Old Testament through the lens of the Israelites. So I enter into the narrative, I identify with the Israelites, I go to school and study ancient Egyptian history, and I take pride in the Pharaonic period. That just creates this kind of dichotomy and otherness within self, right? Like you just like living this hybrid identity, being both Egyptian and Israelite, till like I started asking myself, why do I do that, and what do I make of the way the Bible portrays Egypt in this negative way. And obviously, there are like various ways to engage that. One is that Egypt is not only portrayed as a place of oppression. As I mentioned, during the time of Abraham, the time of Joseph, even Jesus, and during the time of Jeroboam, Egypt was also portrayed as a place of refuge. So we have, in some ways, two portrayals: Egypt as a place of refuge or Egypt as a place of oppression. It's unfortunate that we tend to essentialize Egypt as only a place of oppression. And I think that has to do with ritualizing that, because it gets connected to a central festival and important ritual, which is the Passover.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so once you ritualize a narrative, then it becomes constant. But I think there is a lot of work on our part to do in de-essentializing a particular group and a particular community in terms of how they are portrayed, how they are remembered, how they are othered in that way because of a particular narrative. So to remember that Egypt is also functioned, even in the biblical traditions themselves, as a place of refuge. And instead of reading it as a continuous narrative where we move from refuge to oppression, we read them as actually parallel narratives, because even the Joseph story might have been written at a later time, offering the Israelites who were oppressed by the Babylonians, or the Judahites who were exiled by the Babylonians after 587 BCE, a place of refuge. So it's an alternative.
Yeah.
This is one way. The other way that I want to mention is by asking myself, and by doing this exercise of reading the text as an Egyptian, then I ask myself, in what places do I possess power and privilege, and how do I use them? So I read the text against myself. So I don't shy away from how Egypt is portrayed, even though this is a construction of a particular memory and it should not be essentialized. But when I enter into that, I ask myself, as a straight male, maybe middle class, privileged in some ways with education or able body, whatever aspects of identity that I possess power through which, I ask myself, how do I use that? But then when I read also the narrative through how Hagar is portrayed in the book of Genesis, who is an Egyptian, oppressed by the Israelites, and now reading also the Exodus through the lens of the oppressed themselves, because I don't possess in all aspects of power as a Christian Egyptian. I'm a minoritized because of my faith. Egypt experienced colonialism at the hands of the French and the British, and continues to be in some ways orchestrated between the Western and the Eastern camps in some ways. So how do I enter this as someone who also experiences some sort of powerlessness in other aspects of identity?
Yeah.
And I think this is crucial for all of us reading the book of Exodus in also an American setting. Yeah. We ask ourselves, why do we read the book of Exodus through the lens of the Israelites? And maybe we are actually much closer to how Egypt is portrayed in the Bible rather than the Israelites. What do we lose and what do we gain when we do this hermeneutical dance of entering the texts once through the lens of the Egyptians, once through the lens of the Israelites, and asking ourselves, where do we possess power and privilege, and what do we do with them? And when do we experience powerlessness, and what do we do about that? How do we resist that? How do we seek to change that? How do we create a space for God to reveal God's self as a liberator in these times when we experience powerlessness?
That's brilliant. Wow. I mean, that's so helpful for Scripture as a whole. Right? That as in terms of helping, I think, our viewers get a sense of, how you enter into this and what it means to call it Scripture. Right? This isn't just an exercise in historical memory, but this is actually, where does this text speak Word of God in new, fresh, challenging, and liberating ways today? I love that.
Absolutely. I love that too. I think this whole conversation could be a frame for our whole year of study, not just this week. Safwat, we are so grateful for your time with us. This has been an incredibly illuminating conversation, and so grateful for the work that you are doing in the church at Union and beyond. And thank you for taking this time with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Matt. And maybe we'll have another chance to actually talk about monsters.
Yes. Oh, we missed the monsters. Yes, we'll have to come back for monsters.
We will.
Yeah. Yes. Wonderful.